transforming social inequalities through inclusive climate action. So this is a truly innovative project in the way that it brings together economists as much as climate experts. And this is one of those conversations where we have two experts in their field, the one being Associate Professor Abena D at the University of Ghana, and Jiska de Groot, Dr. Jiska de Groot, sorry, at the African Climate and Development Initiative, senior researcher, very much specialist in energy access. And the purpose is really to learn about each other's work and to have a mediated conversation around synergies, around finding where there might be similar ideas on how we analyze and think about gender in these different separate but also quite critically intertwined fields. So my name is Britta Renkamp. I'm also a researcher at ACEIR, African Climate and Development Initiative at the University of Cape Town. And I'm here to chair this session. And we're going to do it in the following way. We're going to have the two speakers. So Jiska is going to kick us off with her talk. Then we're going to invite Abena for a brief reflection on her presentation and then invite you all for a Q&A. You're also very welcome to put your questions or suggestions or thoughts in the chat. We'll be monitoring that. And then we'll continue with Abena's presentation, invite Jiska for some reflections and do some more Q&A. We're hoping to get all of these important issues to be dealt with within an hour, which is why I'm not going to keep you much longer, and would invite Jiska to please go ahead. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Britta. Let me first do the most challenging bit of the whole presentation, is to share my screen in one go properly. And I'll be starting our presentations today, and I hope really that my presentation will give a snapshot of some of the work that we've been doing on gender and just creating a value in sort of what is considered a marginal sector, and that is the informal food sector, so the street food sector in South Africa, and women's businesses in that sector. Oh, I don't know why. Let me change. So what really is my presentation about then? As I said, it's about creating value in women's businesses, specifically focused on South Africa's informal street food sector, and it really looks at the way in which the entrepreneurship in this sector is creating individual value to entrepreneurs, but also a value that extends much broader than just that individual value. And then following that, and hopefully hooking into Abena's presentation, is to start exploring some of the synergies of addressing social inequalities and climate action to really make it relevant for the audience today. And I hope it kicks up a lot of conversation and a lot of discussion. So first I'll introduce you a bit to the study itself and the broader background of the street food sector, the informal food sector in South Africa. Then I'll focus on this issue of value creation in the sector, and then linking it directly to climate action, social inequality, and pretty much through investigating some of the energy issues that relate to the street food sector. So before we start, this presentation is the result of several years of research that we started in 2015. And it is part of a larger study that was funded by Energia and the UK's FCDO, which was still then DFID. And the study really set out to build an evidence base on gender and energy aspects of the informal food sector in South Africa, Senegal, and Rwanda, and start exploring these linkages between energy use, enterprises, households, as well as women's empowerment. Then start looking into the contextual factors that influence the use of different energy services by men and women. And so you'll see this is was originally a very energy focused project, but and I'll come back to that a bit later. But one of the key things that we found in this study is that issue of value creation and how this helps women's empowerment and how those dynamics in the informal food sector actually make a lot of difference. And that's why I specifically want to highlight that in the presentation today. So methodologically, there's qualitative interviews that this was based on, so 49 semi-structured interviews with entrepreneurs. That is in the South African case study only. Then we conducted a questionnaire survey across all the study sites. And the sampling we really sought out to find in peri-urban and urban areas, informal food enterprises, for example, at transport hubs, marketplaces, roadsides, but also home-based enterprises. Okay, so moving on to a little bit of background on the informal sector itself. So the informal sector, for those of you that are unaware with the terminology, consists of enterprises that are not formally registered. They generally keep no accounts, or at least no formal accounts, and the employees working in those businesses are also not formally registered. And the sector it's very large, and it provides an income for many people in developing economies. And to illustrate, it provides a livelihood for over 60% of people globally. Importantly, and this also came back later in the presentation, it has low barriers to entry. And the informal food sector specifically provides a really, really important food security support mechanism in rapidly urbanizing societies. In South Africa, so as I said, I'll be focusing specifically on South Africa today. Roughly 2.1 million people in 2012 already operated in the informal economy. So that is not necessarily the informal food sector. Like it's, that is a number that is hard to quantify, but it just gives you an idea that the sector is huge. And you can imagine that, with a lot of people losing formal jobs because of COVID, this informal sector is growing even more. Unfortunately, the South African government really views this informal economy as like a second economy, and it's something that is highly undesirable, something that needs to be eradicated, not really thinking about the millions of people that depend for their bread and butter on the sector. And because this webinar is focused on gender, the South African informal food sector is what I decided to focus on today, because it has a very high participation of women. So when we're talking about the informal food sector, we're really talking about like street food or food processing and preparation. Then, so women's informal enterprises in South Africa. So what is it that drives women into the more informal end of the economy? And so the literature has identified like a whole set of reasons that a lot of them, sometimes they all apply, sometimes only a few of them apply. But a really important one is that there's low barriers to entry. So it makes there's things like skills and qualifications are often less needed. You don't have to rent a space necessarily to start selling food products, and so it's an easy and relatively easy step for people to step into the sector. There's also few or no registration regulations, for example, about where you're allowed to sell your stuff or in what way that is all possible. There's limited need for startup capital. And a really important one also that I'll be coming back to is that it allows women to combine their domestic responsibilities with generating an income for their families. And as a result of these things above, women really dominate the informal food sector here in South Africa. And moving now onto this issue of value creation. So what is that exactly? And so one of the ways in which to look at it is that this value creation is the success that is brought about by a person's enterprise in financial and non-financial terms. And the value created for women by running an enterprise, for example, can encompass a range of aspects of their life, including like the social, psychological, like an environmental, but also monetary values. And so Zara and colleagues in 2009 already identified sort of 3 key principles of value creation that will be driving some of the snapshots of the data that I'll be I'll be showing to you in the next 10 minutes. And the first one is like the issue of concept. So to create value, somebody needs to have a business idea or a niche that they can see themselves operating in. Then secondly, a really important one, which I think Abena's presentation will also then hook further into, is that like the available resources to the entrepreneur and their ability to have assets. Then thirdly, the implementation. So really the ability and the skills of the entrepreneur to execute and implement the idea and use the resources that are available to her. And so value creation and entrepreneurship. And today, entrepreneurial outcomes have been largely studied in terms of financial performance, wealth creation, firm survival, and improvement of quality of life. And that's why there's been this really key focus on growth and monetary growth here, and like really expanding a company rather than looking at the different ways in which value is created through an enterprise. And that has often resulted in like this really one-sided analysis and appraisal solely of businesses in monetary terms without any reference to its social impact. And it's problematic that other kinds of value that come from entrepreneurship are not really taken into account, because as the following slides will show you, that the value created for these women by having their enterprises actually extends a hell of a lot beyond just monetary value. And as the title of the slide already suggests, there's also relations to women's empowerment in this process. So linking back to our data now, so the street food entrepreneurs in our study, like they really showed us examples of how value is created through their businesses. And in the next few slides, I'll give examples of that value creation and the different levels among the different enterprises. So firstly, that of concept. So when we're looking at concept, it's their idea, but also the contextual values that affect value creation in their enterprises. And really importantly, so many of the women we spoke to indicated that they saw this niche, that they had this idea of what they wanted to do. They didn't want to just sit at home unemployed or do nothing. They really wanted to get out there, and they saw a way of doing that. And as Sego, a married woman in Cape Town, indicated, she said, like, people always want it, and she was selling barbecued meat, and she said it's so easy to start. All you need to do is you need to find a good spot. And so which is what she did, and she's been selling barbecued meat for quite a long time now, and generating what she considered a decent income. And then another woman from our Durban case study said, it is so empowering to have a business because it's better than sitting at home. And we'll come back to sort of that issue of like, is it really a choice if otherwise you would be sitting at home? But this having an idea of what you wanted to do and then actually doing it, people felt that was very empowering. And in the South African case study, like issues such as high unemployment, family situations, and skill sets often resulted in women going into food selling or preparation business because they said, like, I'm a good cook already, I know what to do, or the cooking business it's something I can do for a few hours a day, and the rest of it gives me some flexibility to actually look after my family, and it can work with my life rather than them turning their lives around for the business. Then a really important issue is access to resources. And because informal food sector entrepreneurship unfortunately comes with very few resources. There's generally no loans, subsidies, or support, limited access to municipal services, business accelerators, because they're simply not that interested in businesses that don't have that same growth paradigm of expansion, borrowing money, expanding even more. And it's really hindering company growth for those that are interested. And unfortunately, as a very smart lady in our Durban case study said, like, without money, it won't grow, but how do you grow that? And yeah, so that is very hard because of the informal nature of the sector. And the sector is also often actively oppressed. Like, think of restrictive urban planning policies that focus on formal businesses rather than accommodating informal traders. They're often harassed by the police, their stock has been taken, and they're also not accounted for in development policies, which means, linking back to my previous point, that often in the long term, these people still will not have access to say, loans, subsidies, or support. And there was a lot of resourcefulness among our entrepreneurs. They were very innovative and tried to overcome this lack of resources and manage the informality. And like one of our respondents said that she puts her money into a little bit of a hoi hoi, which is one of the women's circles where they collect money for a specific person once a month, and it goes around. So there is money entering into it, but it is also informal money sharing again. Then moving on to agency and a woman's ability to implement her business ideas, so going agency and back to her concept. And agency creates value in itself because it provides entrepreneurs with the ability to implement their ideas. So it's a very, very empowering concept. And as Faith, one of our Cape Townian respondents, said, like, in my own business, it gives me a steady income that I can work with, and that is good. You see, I can make plans for the future because it gives me a budget. And then another respondent said, like, women are now more independent and self-reliant. They no longer depend on men to earn a living. So yeah, these are like really, really important points in sort of processes of empowerment, which are also on the value creation line. And yeah, so linkages between increased agency and positions in the households we also found, including for single and but also for partnered individuals. And interestingly, and this comes back to some women being forced to operate in the sector, there often was a preference for self-employment in the sector because they said it felt so good to be their own boss, decide on their own money, decide on their own working hours. It had a freedom to operate, and also this notion of independence. And yeah, so these are really important because they lead to like achievements and things of value creation, and that is the extent to which somebody's potential is realized or fails to be realized. And so it's really comes back to the outcome of the efforts of our entrepreneurs. And I think Faith, the lady to the left, is a really, really good example of it. So when we interviewed her in 2017, she said she was running her shop with a lot of joy. Her husband had another job, and he just enjoyed her having the shop. And she was going to close the business because she actually went back to school and and study for another profession. So her having her informal business ensured that she and her husband could look after her family, but then also she could further build herself and her own career with the money that she generated from the business. And yeah, and so that's like really this empowering effect that our enterprise had. Karabo, a lady in a similar position said, because I work for myself, I earn my income and I can budget the amount I want for income, and I do the things I want to do, compared to somebody who has a job and wait for wages. I can push my income the way I want. I can easily make decisions. So so for a lot of our respondents, that was really, really an important issue to be able to forge their own path, and their informal enterprises helped achieve this. Before handing over for discussion, I want to link this back because I guess most of us will be in the climate action and social inequality sphere. And so where does this informal street food sector in urban South Africa fit in? And really important in relation to climate action is that the sector is highly dependent on energy. And so defining what's cleaning up of the informal sector means is really essential, because one of the things we found in the energy component of our study is that there were so many different energy uses. We found everything from wood to charcoal to LPG to paraffin to electricity. And there were very good reasons for using those. Some of the advantages of modern energy sources was that it was easier, quicker, faster, and cleaner than traditional sources. But often these traditional type of sources, such as wood and charcoal, were used for like cultural preferences, customer preferences. Sometimes it was faster, sometimes it would improve the taste. So it is really important that, when looking at sort of where can we clean up the energy supply of the sector, we don't lose touch of what it is that these enterprises need and how they operate. And things such as like location of enterprises, type of food prepared, the level of formality of the enterprises, customer preferences, and local regulations are all of influence on sort of the parameters in which we can make improvements in the sector in relation to climate change. And unfortunately for sort of modern energy services is that the high price of them remains a key barrier to uptake them in the sector, as well as their availability. And so one of the things I really want to stress here is that, so rather than in our climate action efforts move and really push towards modern energy services, let's start the conversation open enough to talk about appropriate services for the enterprises and not force an enormous sector down a specific road. So rather than forcing switching fuels, help organize and clean up maybe of a traditional energy supply chain. And then secondly, linking to the social inequalities and is creating a value. So we really found that entrepreneurship in the street food sector for the women in our study created significant value. For example, like the personal value, where having an enterprise contributed to a sense of independence, self-reliance, both for single-headed households, but also people living in partnership. At a business level, like monetary value, but also really importantly for family level, because enterprises provided the flexibility needed to allow women to combine their home responsibilities with income generation. And obviously that then leads to potential important societal level contributions as well, because it creates value that extends far beyond the individual into like much broader benefits, such as improved education and welfare of children because of the value created at a personal, business and family level. But also at a societal level, the informal food sector does provide an important source of home cooked and meals that are not necessarily fast food, so they contribute to food security in urban areas. And so the value that was created in the process and that moves beyond financial gain only, and it encompasses independence, freedom of choice and movement, confidence, pride in their endeavors, flexibility to generate an income and look after families. And these were all really important benefits of operating in the informal food sector, and we really shouldn't lose out on those. And so a thriving sector, though, is highly dependent on the local area in which it operates. So local authorities are key in influencing regulations that impact on business success, their energy use, and all of these things that are so important. And so one of the things we can do there is to better integrate between municipal and local authorities from different sectors to make sure that climate action, financial benefits for informal entrepreneurs, and which will help address social inequality, go hand in hand rather than operate in silos. And to do that, like, we also need to understand the sector for improved spatial planning, one that also integrates climate action. And then, the street food sector is here to stay. the informal sector is only growing. So rather for South Africa, rather than to consider it something we're trying to get rid of, actually acknowledge that it is going to stay, and that it is something that provides a lot of value for a lot of people, and it has an important role in feeding South Africa's urban populations. So policymakers really need to work with the sector rather than against it, and removing it from the urban landscape, and work towards an environment in which businesses and the environment can thrive, as well as the women working in it. And I would like to leave it at this and open up the floor for questions. And let me stop sharing my screen.
Thank you very much for this insightful talk. Very fascinating. I just wanted to invite Abena, if you had any thoughts you would like to share.
Yes, I have maybe one thought and a question. And I think this presentation, looking at value creation, and I must confess, I had been thinking of value creation differently when I was just looking at the topic. So I find that it is quite it is a nice alternative, and not just nice, an important alternative to thinking about self-employment, because it answers a question which is sometimes found in the literature. Now, why do we find women in industries or in businesses that are not growing, using the usual monetary or financial criteria? And it is precisely because of these other types of value creation. And so therefore, presenting it in this way in terms of value creation then gives it an importance, as opposed to something that can be ignored as we still continue to focus on monetary and financial indicators. So this is what I think is very, very important. And I would say that many of the examples that you have provided, you could say, are success stories, for want of a better expression. And I mean, we in many African countries, we have the street food vendors. And I was thinking about what are the challenges? What are the challenges to this process of value creation? And indeed, if I think of work which we did many years ago in Ghana, you find that the informal work, as much as we talk about flexibility, there is also the issue of how long do they work? So maybe we need to add up all those hours that they do work. Yes, they may be able to take off and go and do one thing and come back. So we then just would ask ourselves, what are the implications of the length of time that they work for their well-being? This is something that I was thinking about as you made the presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Abena. Yeah, that's so. Just picking up right on the last bit of what you said on that time commitment. We had a look at how many hours they operate, how many hours it takes them to source stuff, to pack up at the end of the day, how much they're paying to sometimes have somebody look after their stuff and not. And we found an enormous range. We found people that just made a quick few buck in the morning on a taxi rank before they would go on a taxi to another job themselves. They standing there with a bucket of boiled eggs and making some extra money there, to people that get up at 4 a.m. to start preparing their vetkoek and start selling them. So it's a really interesting range. It differs depending on the type of products, but also we had so many different enterprises that where some had like high degrees of, I'm going to use the word professionalism, but they're all professionals. But some of them looked much more formalized and looks much more big and successful. But here I just want to really place caveats between how do we identify success? Are we using the standard couple of 100-year-old metrics that are generally a very masculine notion of what growth and what success is? Or are we actually looking at a much broader perspective of what is success and how do we identify success? Because already sort of our enterprises, and because we also investigated male enterprises, is that a lot of the women would grow differently. They would diversify, they would spread risk, because they would say, I'm feeding my family and I'm not going to risk a single enterprise that gets blown up too quick for its own good. I much rather have a little hair salon and a food business and another business. So yeah, just like, yeah, I'd say the growth paradigm we need to investigate a bit more in this world.
Thanks, Jiska. Martin is asking a question in the chat, if you want to open it. So he's asking, he's saying that economists worry about survivorship bias when interviewing firms. So that would be you. See the firms that have managed to survive, but you do not interview those that went under. Is there any information on women who may have tried to work in the informal sector but did not succeed?
We spoke to them. Yeah. We snowballing. We also managed to speak to some people that that didn't make it, and in a lot of cases, we found that the reasons why they didn't make it were not necessarily financially, because the entry barriers were so low, but they found that, for example, the time spent on home responsibilities or having to juggle multiple other things, family illnesses, that is what made people in our sample drop out, rather than starting up an informal business and, you know, not selling the chicken you buy in a day. Because also sometimes the chicken that is bought at the beginning of the day, even if no profit is made on it, what is left over gets eaten by the family or gets used in a different way. I hope that clarifies a little bit. But it is a super interesting area to expand on, like what happens to those that don't make it on a much bigger scale. Where do they go? How do they go from there?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Jiska. And I was also thinking in terms of setbacks, right? So that you might go under for a bit, but you might also have resilience to shocks, as you said, like people get robbed or harassed by the police, get their things taken away. So just also leading to Abena's presentation in terms of asset ownership. What kind of assets do these women actually need to bring in order to make it in the first place, right? So there's a lot of food for thought, I think, food literally for thought. Yeah. But I would like to move on to the next presentation in the interest of time. We're still going to have a bit of time for further discussion where we can touch on these issues. Abena, if you would like to start your presentation. And then feel free. Also, attendees, put more questions in the chat, or also raise your hand if you would like to talk. Thanks a lot, Abena.
Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see it. If you want to put it on the presentation mode, if you have, or maybe make the slides a bit bigger. Now we can see it. Perfect. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to be looking at ownership rights, gender, and land improvement in Ghana. And to begin with, this presentation is based on work that was conducted by myself and two other colleagues in the Department of Economics. And so we're going to explore the relationship between the ownership rights of women and men and land improvement in Ghana. And basically we want to look at two questions. Do women and men have the same bundle of ownership rights? And does the bundle of rights matter for land improvement and investment? But why are ownership rights important for land improvement or investment? And a number of theories have been proposed. And the first is what is referred to in the literature as the assurance effect. And this ensured, i.e. by having property rights, it gives the farmers security and the farmers are sure that they will be able to reap the returns on their investment. So this is one reason why property rights are important. And another is linked to credit, because once you own an asset that has defined property rights, in particular, once you own land that has defined property rights, then one would be able to use the land for collateral, and therefore it increases one's access to credit, reducing the credit constraint. And the third argument for why property rights are important is to do with transferability. Once you have property rights, you're going to be able to, you could lease out the land, you can also sell the land. And so having property rights, it's been argued, are important. These are three of the reasons why property rights are important for land investment. And I would like us to look at what we mean by ownership and indeed what these property rights are. And so ownership relates to is the relationship between a person and an object. And basically ownership is having a bundle of rights. And Oduro in 1961 identified 11 rights: right to possess, right to use, right to manage, right to income. We have 11 rights that define ownership and rights in the relationship of a person or an individual to an object. But that relationship between a person and an object doesn't have to be defined by all those rights. So it is possible that you can have, and we will see this in the data that we have, that you can have people who report themselves as owners, but then the bundle of rights that they have is not identical to the bundle of rights of other people who report themselves to be owners. So the fact that the relationship between an object and a person is defined by some rights opens up then the discussion to the issues of gender, and really do women and men have the same bundle of rights. But before we go into that, we're going to be looking at which bundle of rights defines an owner. And I am going to make use, and we use that in the paper, of the typology that was designed by Schlager and Ostrom, where basically we have, as we know, we have a spectrum of rights, and therefore we have a spectrum of owners, moving on from the person who is an authorized user to somebody who can be defined as an owner. So we have access and withdrawal rights, where the individual can, in terms of land, enter the land and cultivate the land. And this runs across the different specters of individuals. We have management rights, we have exclusion rights, and then we have alienation rights, where alienation rights are having the right to be able to sell the asset, having the right to be able to bequeath the asset, having the right to be able to lend the asset. And I remember some number of years ago, when we at a workshop where we were discussing this thing of ownership rights, I remember a lady from Malawi saying, with respect to the ownership of cattle, the owner of the cattle is that person who can go into the yard where the cattle are being kept and says, kill that cattle. That is what defines an owner in terms of alienation rights. So this is the template that we are going to be using for our study. In terms of empirical evidence on the distribution of ownership rights by gender, studies that have looked at this issue, Burkina Faso, Haiti, Malawi, they all find that women have fewer rights than do men. And if one wants to have a hierarchy of rights, then you would find that the women tend to have weaker. Some studies have found, for example, in Burkina Faso, that women, when they do have rights to their land, tend to have weaker rights than do men. Now, Moving on, so we wanted to look at the question is, what are ownership rights? Who has the rights? And we've looked at empirical evidence from other studies. Then there is the issue of this relationship between rights and land improvements. So indeed, given the expected benefits of having strong property rights, one would expect that there's going to be a positive relationship between these property rights and investment. There's quite a lot of literature on this, and I have some examples up here, where you find that some studies are looking at legal ownership and looking at documents, and other studies are looking at ownership which is not backed by documents, reported ownership and reported rights, where the thinking is that if one should have legal ownership, then indeed it means that you have the full gamut of rights. And if I may say, the research that I had been involved in a 3-country study, Ghana, India, and Ecuador, we found that in Ecuador, when our colleagues conducting their research were asking about the different rights, you have if you are an owner of a house or the owner of a land, you have the right to sell, to bequeath. They were literally laughed out of the room, because as far as they were concerned, once you had the document, then you had all those rights. Within our context also, within the African context, we should remember that we tend to have like a plural legal system where you have the customary rights and or customary law, which defines rights. And then you have the, depending upon where you have the common law. Anyhow, when we look at the evidence before us, and we find that the findings are mixed. In some studies, they find that there is a positive relationship between having legal documentation and investing, some form of investment in land. And in other studies, for example, by Huntington and Shenoy for Zambia, and we don't find that there is any relationship. Having land is not significant. Having a certificate is not significantly associated with investment. We must note, as I mentioned before, that in many countries, formal registration of land is not widespread, although many countries are also trying to introduce land registration programs. Now, when it comes to the non-documented rights, where in this instance you would find that in many of these surveys, the reported landowners are going to indicate in response to questions which rights they have. We find again that there is mixed evidence. An early study in Ghana by Besley, for example, found that in the Wassa area, this is in one part of southern Ghana, transfer rights, the right to be able to sell and bequeath, were significantly associated with investment. But in another study to the eastern part of Ghana, they didn't find such an association. So again, you find that there is some mixed evidence in terms of the relationship between what I'm referring to here as non-documented rights and investment. Now, does the sex of the rights owner matter? And there are not that many studies that consider the sex of the rights holder. I'm reporting here on 3 of them, where, for example, in Rwanda, there was a positive effect was found on the land title program on investment by female headed households. In Haiti, on the other hand, we found that inherited plots owned by women were less likely to be invested in. Women in Haiti also were less likely to have the same gamut of rights as men. And in Malawi, it depended upon the type of investment. So coming to Ghana and the recent work that we have we did, we made use of the Ghana Household Assets Survey, nationally representative survey, which was conducted in 2010 by colleagues in the Department of the University of Ghana. The objective of the survey was to collect individual level asset data, where the first parts of the questionnaire would collect literally an inventory of assets in the household and who owned them. And in the second part of the survey, we would then go to 2 individuals in the household and then ask them more detailed questions on each asset. Now, who was the owner? How did we identify an owner? We did not limit ourselves to identifying owners based on documentation, because we know that there's very limited documentation of assets. And indeed, in our data set, it was only about 3 to 4% of women and men. There was no significant difference between them who owned land that was documented. So basically, there's the reported ownership where the individual would identify him or herself as being the owner. And then we also ask questions of these reported owners. We then ask them questions about their ownership rights. So our sample in this study comprises of owners of plots where we had 1,410 plots with 825 owners, meaning that some owners had more than one plot. And then in the sample, 73% of the plots are owned by men. So what do we find about the distribution of rights? Well, on the very top row, we asked a question about if there had been any land improvements in the last 5 years. And 25% of the women said yes, and 34% of the men said yes. So again, we have this difference in the likelihood of investing in one's land. When we look at the category of rights, we focus on we are informed by the Schlager-Ostrom template, where we find that when it comes to access and withdrawal rights, women are more likely to have access, to have only, and it is only access and withdrawal rights compared to men. They're more likely to have management rights, less likely to have economic rights, that is making decisions on how one is going to use the revenues, and they are less likely to have alienation rights, that is the right to bequeath, the right to sell, and the right to rent. So we find that, yes, indeed, within Ghana's context, women and men don't have the same bundle of rights. And if we think alienation rights are the stronger of the rights, then we find that they are less likely, 0.06% of the p-value, to have those rights. But the pattern of rights that they have, distribution of rights, is not the same between women and men. So we then use an econometric model to try to look at this relationship between land rights and investment. And there's a debate in the literature that the land rights can affect investment, and investment can also affect rights, so that there's a two-way relationship. And so a number of studies have tried to control for the two-way relationship, and we adopted one of these strategies in our work. And other studies, some of the more recent studies, have not taken that into account. The argument being that if indeed we have reverse causality, then we can overestimate the effect of rights on investment. So basically, we have our equation one here is our investment equation, where we have the rights, and then we have independent explanatory variables given by W. Then we have our rights equation, and then we have investment as an explanatory variable. And then we have a set of independent explanatory variables. And we use the two-stage conditional maximum likelihood method to arrive at our results. And what do we find? If we should look at ownership rights after taking into account the issues of an endogeneity which we think may exist, we find that investment in men's plots is positively associated with an increase in rights. So as men invest in their plots, then we have an increase. We find that there's an increase in the rights that they have. But we find that in the case of women, though the investment has a positive relationship with ownership rights, we find that that relationship is not significant. So if we should look at investment, what do we find in terms of are rights important in influencing? Is there a positive relationship between rights and investment? Would rights explain, inform, determine investments? So we had withdrawal and user rights, you could say, are our default. So if we should compare other rights with the withdrawal and user rights, we have an unexpected relationship where we find that additional rights, the right to be able to decide on what crop to grow, the right to decide on how the revenue is spent, the right to be able to sell, rent, or bequeath, we find that having those rights doesn't increase the probability of investment. In our sample of men, we run separate models for women and men. So we have this negative relationship, but these are not significant. In the women's regression as well, we have this negative relationship, which I've said is unexpected. And then one of the rights, that is women's economic rights, is negative and significant, suggesting that women who have the right to determine how to use the revenue from their crops are less likely, compared to women who don't have those rights, are less likely to invest. So we find these results are a bit puzzling, although having said that, not finding a relationship between rights and investment has been found in other studies, but it is, again, something to some extent you could say which was unexpected. So how do we interpret these results? Well, one could interpret these results by saying is that what matters is that there are user rights. What matters is that the individual has access to the land. What matters is that the individual can farm the land. And it is these user rights, you could say, which are the minimum security that is required. These withdrawal and user rights are recognized by society. And this may be enough to ensure security of tenure. So these results also take us back to work done by Goldstein and Oduro, where there's this issue about fallow, and that if you leave the land to fallow, this can increase the results that you would maybe lose the land. And so for this reason, women are less likely to fallow for longer periods to make sure that they secure their rights to the land compared to men. And what was important was one's position in society. So land improvements, these findings also suggest that land improvement or investment decisions may be influenced by other factors that we have not fully captured here. And that maybe just the ownership rights per se are not enough to inform, are not enough or do not play as important a role as we are thinking in the decision on whether or not to invest in land. I can't provide, or we've not been able to provide, an adequate answer to why we have this negative but significant association between women's economic rights and land improvements. That still remains a puzzle. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this insight, yet very shocking results. It's a very sad story, and it opens a lot of questions actually that could be qualitative in nature, no? That one would have to just add some qualitative inquiries to those, because in your sample, if you have about 850 male, a full sample, and then 75% of those are male already, then the sample of women is actually going to be manageable to probably do some sort of survey. So I can see a next conversation around mixed methods approaches. Very interesting to see your quantitative work and also Jiska's work, more qualitative in nature. Jiska, can I invite you to give your thoughts to Abena? Thanks for the presentation. It was very, very interesting.
Yeah, so same here. I needed my full brain to actually grasp what it was that you were saying. And yeah, and sort of, I guess coming from like this informal perspective almost, sort of yeah, so that's partly where my mind stayed a little bit. So you know, like how things like how do like a right to capital and economic rights, like how do things like that relate to informality in general, for example? So I guess they're almost like standing like opposite to each other, but I guess things that are put down in law, there is a whole other economy, there's a whole other world out there that is not necessarily sort of embedded in legal frameworks. And yeah, and I just wonder sort of if you had any thoughts on that, whether there's opportunities there or whether it just makes things more difficult to improve.
Okay. If I got your question right, you're basically asking how do these rights relate to informality?
Yeah.
Is that it? Well, many of these, the rights that people are reporting, you could say are informal. So you find that in some of the work that is done, they would refer to it as informal rights or perceived rights. Simply because there's no documentation to support. When I say I have the right to sell, I don't have a legal document attaching which shows my relationship to the land. So the argument is, what is important therefore is, because it's now based on customary law and tradition, the fact that within the community, you are accepted as the owner of the land. Within the family, within the household, you are accepted as the owner of the land. So really, these rights that we are talking about anyhow are you could say, informal rights. There is no documentation to support them.
Okay, so it all joins the messy world of reality in which...
Yes, and then on the other hand, you also have people who have legal documents as well. So you have people who have legal documents to a plot of land, and then you also have a significant proportion of the land-owning population, if you could call it that, who don't have legal ownership, but consider themselves as owners, others to be owners of the property.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, thank you. It's a very important issue. I remember when I first went to Ghana to visit, we also went on a field trip, and there was exactly that. You could see actually the competition between formal and informal land ownership, where traditional land was then allocated by the chief of that area, and they had put it in areas where there's flooding, and they were actually those houses were marked with crosses to be knocked down, but obviously that would be political suicide, I would assume. There's a related question in this chat from Doug Roll Hansen, saying exactly that. Sometimes property rights are not all that formalized. Was it difficult for respondents to say who owns land or other property? For example, if it belongs to a wife or a husband or both?
No, it wasn't difficult at all. Number one, you find that in Ghana, quite a bit of the assets are owned individually. But you do have, because we also have at home this concept of family land, where the land belongs to the lineage. And we were told, when the person would say, do you own this plot that you are farming on? Yes. How did you acquire it? And they'll tell you family land. And if they own the land with other people, their brother, a sister, an uncle, they will indicate so. So it wasn't difficult to get the responses as to who the owners were.
Great, thanks for that. I would just like to ask one last question. So what are you going to do with this puzzle that you're left with? So you said you get very mixed results now, and they're quite alarming. So what are your views?
Indeed, I think the route that you're suggesting is an important one, to conduct a qualitative study as well. I know that there is, I must confess, I haven't had a chance to look at it. There are a few studies in Ghana that have taken a qualitative perspective. And you find that for studies in other countries that also have a qualitative perspective, you find that the qualitative data provides answers to some of these confusing quantitative results that we observe. Because at the end of the day, what is important is the fact that I am using the land. That is an important thing. The fact that other people recognize that the land belongs to me, which other decisions I can take on the land doesn't seem to matter. So we need to tease these things out a little bit more. I would say the quantitative is a good first step. It has brought out contradictions, but we need to delve deeper.
Thank you. I'm aware that we're over time, so if anyone needs to go, please feel free to do so. But I would still like to read out Petra's question in the chat. So she's saying, Abena, if you read this analysis with those with legal documents versus those without legal documents, again, using the gender lens, do you think you would have a different or more clear or less puzzling results? Tough one.
It is indeed, Petra. On one hand, I would say that the having the legal documents would really secure the tenure for women. So I would say that I would expect a positive response. Then I think of a study in Zambia, which found that the certification made no difference. That is not what informed the decision to invest. So we also have the broader issue of what determines the decision to invest. And we need to also take those into account. Great,
thank you very much. Would any of you like to give some concluding remarks? Anything you'd like to share before we close? Are there no further questions for now? Okay, thank you so much. This was really an inspiring conversation, and take it as the first one of many more. It's such a critical issue and it tends to be overlooked, and we often, the women in the room, kind of pushing this agenda, and I'm grateful for all the men who have joined us. So thanks very much. It's really a nice turnout, and we're looking forward to the next one. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.